Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Ogti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul explore behavioral economics. They discuss a few biases and heuristics that attempt to explain why humans and societies don't operate with their best interests in mind. They provide specific examples of how individuals or organizations can take advantage of or exploit the brain's preference to be lazy. So once you understand how your mind works, how can you take control to nudge yourself in the right direction? Listen to the end to find out. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ogti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be here today. And thanks, everybody, for listening.
Great to be here as well. For those who have listened to our past episodes, it probably does not surprise you that Trish and I really like looking into the research on behavioral economics and behavioral finance. We've been talking a lot about happiness and well-being, and this really is a big theme. It's even actually the title of our episode, or title of our podcast, The Mind Money Spectrum. We love thinking about how the brain and how your mind think about money. So today we're going to try and go a little deeper, and this might just be kind of a first episode of a multi-part series, or maybe we can fit it all in. But we're going to talk about, again, how the brain thinks about money. This is not necessarily how you come up with decisions or weighing pros and cons of something, but understanding that the brain tends to be pretty lazy when trying to do analytical processes and make informed decisions. And because it's pretty lazy, and comes out from evolutionary psychology and a lot of the original behavioral economics research, it tends to take shortcuts. It tends to rely on biases and heuristics to make a lot of these decisions. So today, Trish and I are going to talk a little about some of the ways the brain kind of fills in the gaps, takes shortcuts to make these decisions faster that are subconscious. You don't even realize them. And if you're aware of how your brain makes decisions, you can start to take advantage of that to either improve your own decision-making process or understand it of why there might be problems or conflicts and how you can overcome those to be able to make the decisions that you want to be on the path that you want in life. If your rational brain says, I know I want to do this, but your behavior doesn't end up going down that path, how can you make the conscious decisions to get in line with where you want to be? So just starting off, Trisha, when we think about behavioral finance or behavioral economics and some of the irrational decisions that humans consistently make, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you about how the brain works and how the brain thinks about money?
Great intro, Aaron. I think to begin, it starts with the primary notion that we maybe have learned in our intro to economics class, where individuals are thought to initially, from a classical perspective at least, to be rational being, meaning we all try to make decisions based upon our own best interests. For the most part, that makes sense. We want to do things that align with what will give us the best possible outcomes. But what we've come to find across many different dimensions is that individuals actually don't operate this way. And neither does society in general. There are many examples of where individuals and society as a whole does not make decisions that are in their best interests. And that's where behavioral economics comes in. A few key examples that you might think about are these kind of biases that come up now and again. A common bias, for example, is the notion of recency bias, where individuals tend to place a lot of emphasis on recent events than what may have happened over longer periods, or what is more statistically common. A good example of this is, for example, think about insurance and like hurricanes. Well, what tends to happen with hurricane insurance, especially if you live down south, is if we've gone many years without a big storm, people start to get a little complacent. They start to think that, oh, I don't really need this expensive policy. Maybe I can increase my deductible or figure out a way to lower my premiums. But after that hurricane hits, what do people do? Well, they get super scared and they run out and load up on more policies. Now, just because you had a storm blow through your, vicinity, your city, or your state, doesn't mean the statistical likelihood of a hurricane has changed. It just means it's on your mind. You've heard about it in the news probably 24/7 if you're tuned in, and it influences your decisions. So what actually happens is people start loading up on insurance after the hurricane hits because it's on their mind. And that's an example of cognitive distortion or a bias that is common.
I like that. I like that. That's a really good example of recency bias specifically. And it's similar to what I've seen, kind of adverse selection a little bit when it comes to insurance. The idea here is, it's actually more from the insurance company's perspective. The people who are paying for the insurance are the ones who are more likely to use the insurance. It's not quite the same recency bias, but it is one of those things of, it's never just the simple case of buying the insurance and then waiting for it to pay off, and the insurance company has a pool of large dollars. There's always reasons that are irrational of why people will use insurance or choose not to use insurance.
Right. It's one of those things where there's a strong sense of probability in the background, but as a human operating, you can't really keep track of all those numbers. So you tend to gravitate towards either what makes you more fearful or what gives you comfort. But either of those may not be justified by the statistics alone.
Mm-hmm. So other than the recency bias, what are some other things that come to mind when you're thinking of behavioral finance and decision-making process?
Well, a key one as it pertains to what we're likely going to discuss in terms of helping overcome these issues is this notion of analysis paralysis. And the idea there is sometimes we're just presented with too much information that we can handle, and then we end up not making a decision at all. So it's an issue that happens across many dimensions, and you would think that having more information and more choices would be better, meaning people have the option to choose across many different things. But it turns out that ends up hurting people. It provides them with too many choices so that they end up not making any choice.
I've seen that. And also the idea of if you need someone to make a choice, you want to give them 2 or 3 options. That anytime you get beyond that, then the either time it takes to make the choice, the confidence in the choice, or just the choice itself go down. The probability of even making a choice go down.
Right. An example of that is early on, you had 2 big computer companies. You had Dell and Apple. And if you recall, a decade or 2 ago, the Dell model was basically you go on their website and you can customize a computer with all the bells and whistles, and you can choose how many GPUs and how many XPUs and whatnot to put in there. And it was great because you have over 50 million combinations to choose from. But then Apple came along and said, how about we do small, medium, large? And just pick from those 3, and that's kind of it. And it turned out the Apple one made a lot more sense for people, because who wants to spend all that time researching an optimal computer if they can just, point and choose rather simply?
I feel that that's a slight dig at me specifically, because last time we talked about how one of my positive emotions related to money was being able to customize my computer exactly the way I wanted it to. Now I remember that was an HP, but I happen to have a Dell computer in front of me right now. And I did the same thing a little over a year ago, where I I specifically went to Dell because I wanted to customize it.
Well, funny you say that. I have a Dell as well, and I too enjoyed customizing it down to the detail. But this is more about, on average, what seems to make sense for the individual and for society. And it's a common theme that has been noticed across the board.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to kind of the origin of this, and even back to kind of why I had trouble using the words behavioral finance or behavioral psychology or behavioral economics. A lot of this is influenced by the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and I apologize to both of them if I've mispronounced their names. I believe they're both Israeli psychologists, and a lot of their research that Daniel Kahneman wrote about in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, it actually led to them winning the Nobel Prize in economics. And this was a pretty big shift. Kind of, how did a psychologist win the Nobel Prize in economics? And this is where we get into what we're talking about, this behavioral economics aspect of, even though traditional economics has this forget the exact Latin phrase, but it's like homo perfectus or homo rational, and if you can fill me in, I'd really appreciate that. But they really influence economics by helping traditional studies realize that people don't make decisions in the best interest by what the economic constraints would be. But if you start to understand how the brain works and how the brain evolved over eons, you get these different aspects of when the brain is thinking fast or thinking slow. In this case, it's relying on kind of quick, instant judgments that human beings use to survive for eons versus the logical analysis that have allowed them to become the dominant species on the planet. And you realize that a lot of times the brain is just lazy. There are so many times that the brain really wants to come to a decision or reaction fast and quick and not have to use any of its energy. And once you start to understand this, you realize that there actually are rational reasons why the brain is making seemingly irrational decisions. And so I want to go kind of, what's the next level of that, of if we understand that the brain is lazy most of the time, what are some examples of that in addition to the recency bias that you can think of right now?
There's a handful of these, and they often tie towards some area of economics or how individuals approach decisions. So we mentioned this notion of recency bias, but also there's this notion of anchoring. And the idea here is there are times when individuals need to make a rough estimate on something. And what they used is their kind of preconceived notion of what that might be. So let me give an example. Let's say you asked individuals what the population of a city is. Let's say it's Chicago. And what people might do is first they might say, okay, what is my city? And I happen to live in a small city. And I'll say, okay, Chicago's larger, therefore I'll multiply my population by 3 or 4. And that'll be my rough estimate. And then what might happen for people who live in a larger city is they might say, okay, I live in New York and I know Chicago is smaller, so I'm going to take my city and divide it by a certain amount. And so they take a rough estimate, and it turns out when people take these type of shortcuts, they either tend to over or underestimate based upon their preconceived notion. And that's where this idea of anchoring comes up. It's been shown that people end up using this bias to make a quick judgment, but it ends up being off because they're taking these shortcuts. As you said, they're thinking fast to come up with the decision, and often it's not taking all the relevant information into account. It's just a quick jump to the answer.
I've seen other experiments where they will use the first number of their license plate. So it's just like you're picking a random digit, 1 to 10, and then you're going to ask a question like, okay, now to the nearest 10%, what's the probability that it's going to rain tomorrow, or some other kind of, or it's going to rain a month from now? And the random number from the license plate, if it was high, they're going to actually provide a higher number for the probability of it, of some random future event. In this case, let's say it rains a month from now. But if it's low, they're actually going to have a lower answer. So if their license plate happens to start with a 1, they're going to say, oh, there might be a 10% chance of rain. And if their license plate starts with a 7, it's like, oh, there's a 40% chance of rain. And the only difference, because they do this across a large enough people, the only difference was that license plate number. But that anchoring effect is so strong that the human brain translates that to the next thing you're trying to think about.
Right. Uh, and this also occurs when people are trying to sell us things in marketing. It's a pretty neat tool that marketing, I guess we can call them experts, since they're actually doing things that change behavior. What that they do to change our behavior. One form of anchoring is you see a price out there and you're not sure, but they start off with a very high price, like, oh, how much is this TV? It's $1,000. Okay, that's quite a lot. But guess what? It's 50% off. It's only $499. Now, if they led with, oh, it's 501, but you get $2 off, you're not so excited. It's the same price in the end, but you just feel a lot better knowing you got 50% off a magic number that nobody's going to pay.
That's a great point. I do think about that whenever I get the ads for sales. I like shopping at Banana Republic, and they seem to be consistently having some kind of sale that's always 30% off, and it feels so consistent. That's like, does anyone ever actually pay full price?
Right.
Like, is it just that magical number that's 30% higher so that every sale is down to where you actually pay?
Right. I think a few retailers have gotten into some trouble because Black Friday, what they tended to do is raise the price before Black Friday and then cut it down on Black Friday so that the sale was actually not that 30%, but actually just a few percent from what you would normally pay.
Okay. So what's the next one that comes to mind after recency bias and anchoring? I have a few others that I'm thinking of.
Yeah, a big one is if you're in the finance industry, that this notion of overconfidence that tends to come up a lot. The idea that if you're investing in stocks, something we talked about early on, you need to make plays where you're kind of outsmarting the market. But if that's really true, what that means is you know something that the rest of the market hasn't quite caught on to or priced into a given stock. So when it comes to overconfidence, what it's been shown is that individuals tend to put a lot of confidence in their ability to make plays when they pick stocks, especially if they had a quick win early on. Meaning if they chose a stock that did well, there's that anchoring notion, the notion that early on they did pretty well, so therefore all their later trades should be just as easy. Of course, discounting the fact that you may have lost, here and there along the way. But it leads to this idea that you're going to do better than you actually will.
Mm-hmm. I see that same example when you ask how many people believe they're above average drivers. And I guess like 80 or 90% of the population thinks they're above average driver, even though by definition, only half the population can be an above average driver.
Yeah, it's something where even if people know that they're being a little overconfident, they can't help themselves from putting them in that pool. Nobody wants to be a below average driver.
Another one I like to think about is when it comes to choices, people, or like I say, brains love going with default options that they've shown a few times when it comes to organ donation. on driver's license applications. The first choice was just a box of like, would you like to be an organ donor? Check the box yes. And something like only 3% of people would check the box to be an organ donor. Different countries and states have tried switching the default where you will be an organ donor unless you check the box no. And they see almost a complete opposite effect. Now, instead of 3% organ donors, it's still 3% people checking the box, but they're opting out. And so now 97% of the population is donating organs on their driver's license. And it's this idea that whatever the default option is the overwhelming choice across a population.
Right. I like that one in particular because when you think about it, the actual cost to implement that solution far outweighs the benefit to society. It's basically free, right? You're just changing some words or text on a form.
Yep.
But what it does is it leads to such a profound change. You wonder, why haven't we done this sooner? Or why aren't we doing this everywhere?
Other examples of that when it comes to 401ks, when it was originally set up where you have to choose to start contributing money, and you just saw really low enrollment rates. People just didn't make the effort to save money. Even if there was employer match dollars, they wouldn't get around to it. As soon as they start implementing last few years, auto enrollment and changing it from opt-in to opt-out, the number of people contributing to 401ks has jumped dramatically. It's the default option is you are contributing to 401k, you're contributing 3 or 6% or whatever the employer match number is. If you want to stop that, there's a quick, easy form. It's just as easy to turn off as it was to turn on originally, but no one actually makes the effort to move away from the default. The vast majority of people are contributing at the same level that they started off at the very beginning when their employer signed them up.
Right. The numbers I saw around that, it was a Vanguard study in particular where the enrollment jumped from 34% when you had to opt in to a 401k to 90% when you had to actually opt out. That's such a big jump, and that can make such a huge difference in society where 30, 40 years from now, when these individuals are trying to retire, they actually have a safety net that they wouldn't have just because of, again, a very simple change in the way a form works for their employer-sponsored retirement plan.
Another one I like is understanding loss aversion. And the way the experiments usually work is I'll give you $1, and then we'll flip a coin based on the results of that. Like, would you like to bet your dollar to go from 0 to 2, 0 or 2, based on the result of that coin flip? And most people would prefer to keep their $1. But if I don't give you the dollar and we flip the coin and it's heads, you get $2, tails, you get 0, everyone wants to bet for that $2 because it's a risk-free scenario. You can do it like if it's 10 to 30, like you can create any range you want and the results are pretty consistent. But people value the gain only about half as much as avoiding the loss. So to get people to kind of make that choice, you'd have to actually give them something like $2 and then we're going to bet $1. So a range is 1 to 3. Then they might accept it. But once you understand kind of just the human brain is wired to avoid loss on a scale of about 50% of the gain or the flip side of that. Now you can also understand why people can make irrational decisions related to stocks where, okay, this stock could go up 10% each of the next 10 years, except for 1 year where it's going to go down 50%. And people will still avoid that, even if you tell them in advance that it's going to go up, because that loss is so much more painful to them. That emotions and feelings and stress and anxiety it creates from the loss, it significantly outweighs the positives from the upside.
Yeah, I think that's a great one, particularly because that was part of the seminal work of Kahneman and Tversky that helped win them the Nobel Prize. It was part of their notion of prospect theory, where people just tend to prefer to avoid losing any money as opposed to acquiring gains, even if the odds are in their favor.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting part here is statistically, it's very clear that if you have a bet where you have a slight edge, it's a coin flip, but you get more if you win than you would lose, you should take that bet all day long.
Yep.
But people time and again say, no, I don't want to lose money. I'd rather give up that opportunity of making more money than I would lose on a coin flip than actually go ahead and take that bet. It's quite interesting. And it's one of those things where you can clearly show that people aren't really motivated by statistical reasoning, but more motivated by emotional loss.
Yep. And so now I hope that listeners kind of understand just some of the ways that your brain makes decisions for you without you realizing it. Kind of here just a few examples, and if you can look up behavioral economics, behavioral finance, there's a lot of reasons why these come into play. There's I've seen on the scale of 20 different identified biases and heuristics that they have good examples for, and they're developing more understanding of how the brain works around money. So the next level is, once you understand some of these, what are some of the things that you can do to take advantage of that understanding? Either helping yourself make better decisions, or I guess avoiding some of the repercussions of this imperfect and inferior decision-making process. So Trish, what are some of the things that come to mind for you when it comes to taking advantage of your knowledge now that you are aware of your own biases?
Well, the thing that comes to my mind is kind of what you mentioned with the 401k example. The idea that we can influence behavior by making a small change in how things look and appear so that we make a decision easier for individuals, including ourselves. And this high level notion is called nudging, where you can nudge yourself or individuals or society in a direction that's more favorable by making these small tweaks to how people perceive information and questions. So I think that's the first thing that comes to my mind, this concept of nudging being an important way of combating analysis paralysis.
That was another behavioral economics book, wasn't it?
Yeah, so this was pioneered by the work of Richard Thaler and Cass Sustein. So Thaler is a University of Chicago professor, and he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 2017. And he co-authored this book with Cass Sustein. He's a Harvard law professor, and he's been cited probably more than any other professor for his work and his research. But the two put out this book called Nudge. And the full title is Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. And what they do is they build off of these theories put forward by Kahneman and Tversky, but they also put in applications on how we can make changes by putting these small tweaks into place that push us in the right direction of making more favorable decisions.
So we talked about the 401k kind of opt-in versus opt-out. It sounds like we could apply some of that choice architecture, where don't give people dozens of choices, just give them small, medium, large.
Right. It's like that Apple model I mentioned. This was initially, I think there was a study at a supermarket, and what they were studying specifically was jams in this case. So what they had is in the control side, they had 30, 40 jams. It's common to see that many in your average supermarket. And they had a little stall where individuals could try, taste, and hopefully buy one of the 30 or 40. And then they ran that same experiment again, but only with 3 or 4, just a few choices. And it turns out when you reduce the amount of choices, when you took away that freedom of expression that we all love in choosing jams, people actually bought more jams. And it's the idea that it got a lot easier to make a decision when so many other choices were off the table. And that's one pretty clear example of how nudging can help.
I like that. I have also seen when it comes to kind of taking advantage of this, we didn't talk about, but there's a future discounting. So one of the ways that the human brain has trouble with is they overvalue today and undervalue the future. So there's whenever you're doing some kind of time value of money based on inflation or growth, $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future. And kind of everyone understands that concept. But the mental discounting rate that the brain applies is almost always wrong. And so if you said you can have $1 today or $2 a year from now, then everyone will people will still take the dollar today. They can't kind of process that 100% rate of return over a year.
It's that whole marshmallow thing for people.
Exactly. And the next level of that is, okay, would you like $1 today, or is something like $2 a week from now? And people will still take the dollar today. But if I say, would you like $1 on January 31st, 2021, or $2 on February 7th, 2021? So as we would apply that same like week-long time frame, but pushed it a year out in the future, then people will say, okay, I'll wait for the $2. I've waited a year, I can wait the extra week to get the $2. And when it comes to using this to help people make decisions, it's easier for people to make commitments to that future self because they don't quite understand, like their brain can't conceptualize the difference today versus the difference tomorrow, and then pushing that out a year. So when it comes to helping people increase their savings, say, okay, you're saving currently 6% of your income. We really got to bump that up. If you try and get them to do it right away, it's kind of like dieting. It's like, oh, it might work for a month, might work for 3 months, might even work for 6 months, but if they reduce their spending to increase their savings, they're not going to do it. It's not going to stick. But if you get them to commit to the next time you get a raise, you increase your savings by the same amount of that raise, they can actually usually make that commitment and hold themselves to it. That commitment today for an action in the future is something that has become more popular based on recommendations from behavioral economics and behavioral finance, that you're taking advantage of the way the brain can't really discount to make better decisions in the future.
I like that. That makes a lot of sense. I think anything that can move the needle with simple tweaks make a lot of sense to me.
What are some other things that you've seen, either done with yourself or done with clients, that are specifically related to behavioral economics, behavioral finance, that you have explored and implemented?
Right. I think a large part of changing behavior, I think, revolves around small changes in general. Like you said, if you're faced with some daunting task, like you need to save for 20, 30 years from now for retirement, or you need to make, incredible health changes to be in perfect health, or you need to overcome some sort of large adversity. It's quite overwhelming, frankly. And the way to have a good chance of success is to start small, make a small tweak. And that's what I encourage. So if somebody isn't saving enough, for example, well, if you're saving nothing, how about this quarter we just save 1% of your income and just put that away. And let's try to ramp that up by just 1 extra% a quarter. So it's not like we're going to jump straight to 15 or 20% where you should be. But if we can get there over just a few years, you'll be well enough ahead of the crowd so that over your lifetime, you'll be set up for having a lot better retirement situation than you would otherwise. And you'll likely not feel it, especially if you can put those increases in a position where, as you mentioned, as your income goes up, you don't immediately spend it. It doesn't immediately drop down into the spending bucket, but it can be shifted towards the automatically saved bucket. And then, like you said, what they did with the 401ks in terms of having an opt out, meaning it automatically gets contributed for you, you can set that up on your own in terms of having any extra funds go straight from your paycheck into that retirement savings account, even if it's taxable. So that's one way to put emphasis on you not having to actually watch that balance grow a bit. And now you tell yourself, okay, I have enough for savings. Now let me figure out what to invest it in and so on. All of that can be streamlined to make that decision easier.
So as much as you can, set up those defaults, set up those automatic processes at the beginning, because your brain's just going to forget about them anyways and just go with whatever the default is.
Right. And there's tricks to do this as well if you're trying to change behavior. You may have heard things like this, where if you want to do something that you're not looking forward to, like your weekly exercise routine, or that jog you're supposed to do every day, well, do something fun while you do that. And maybe that'll let you look forward to that activity a bit more. Maybe watch your favorite TV show, or maybe as a reward for having your cookie from a few weeks ago, you actually have to put a little bit of pain and take that evening walk, things like that.
That's specifically one of the things I have done in my life. I watch the show Silicon Valley on HBO on my iPad only when I'm on the Stairmaster.
Yeah.
So I'm like a season behind because I don't get on the Stairmaster specifically. I'll do other things, but that is my reward for getting on the Stairmaster, is watching Silicon Valley. And I love that. I love that idea of a commitment device, that you've tied something that you're looking forward to with something that you don't necessarily want to do.
Right.
I haven't quite figured out how that apply to finance or savings yet. But if you had any ideas, I'm really open to that.
Yeah. So there's this notion of gamification, where you may have seen this on many different dimensions, but the idea is when humans are treated with a little reward for taking a certain action, even if that reward is kind of meaningless, they'll still be incentivized to make that change. One example that actually has a monetary component is the points that we get for spending money. Now, that's not really meant to help us. That's meant to spend more than we're supposed to. But this idea of adding points to things is helpful for individuals. And there are actually apps out there that can help you with that. Meaning you can go on your app store and you can search for these various types of nudge apps, whether it's for saving money or sticking to your exercise routine. It will set up a system where you get rewarded with smiley faces and stickers and things like that for meeting goals and expectations. And that actually keeps people going. You can get bigger stickers for the longer you've been involved in a certain routine and things like that. So there are certainly ways to make that happen if you want to motivate yourself to make change over time?
I have heard of gamification, and I was aware that like when it comes to some of the Facebook games, it wasn't until you told the story just now that I realized one of the ways I've been influenced. My wife and I like to do the New York Times crossword puzzle, and the app it has is actually a really good crossword app. And we consistently get Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday done. Thursday, we're pretty consistent, but it takes us usually over an hour kind of working throughout the day. So sometimes we don't get to it. Friday and Saturday are much harder, and we do not solve them consistently enough. And then Sunday is supposed to have about the same difficulty as the Thursday puzzle, but because it's bigger, it also takes usually a couple hours. When it comes to those Friday and Saturday puzzles, the app will track your streak. How often have you finished the puzzle in the day it comes out? And we actually got it up to like over a month. I think we had 1 month where we got every puzzle each day. And now, if we don't get the Friday puzzle done on time, our odds of finishing the Saturday puzzle just beforehand, they were pretty low in general, but now we don't even start it. If we don't get the Friday to keep our streak going, to get, I think it's actually literally a gold star on the app.
Right.
That's worth nothing. We won't do the Saturday puzzle because, broke our streak, not going to get it done anyways. We'll just skip to Sunday.
Yeah, basically these are just the stickers we used to get in kindergarten for adults. But
Man,
it's
I
too
didn't
sore.
even like to hear you say that and like think about, oh my gosh, I'm being gamified.
Yeah, I think a CEO I once heard about the points program with a credit card. He said, "Okay, how much does our points program cost?" And his response was, "Nothing. People love their points and they hate using them. It's the best free money advertising scheme we could come up with. People love seeing that number go up, and they just don't like using them. They want a bigger number. So it's something that is been around, but it's something that we can use to motivate ourselves. So why not?"
That's interesting. Well, I'm going to be looking out for things like that. I knew the marketing, I knew the advertising one, but the things are 50% off. And like I tried to tell people, like, no, you didn't save $500 on a TV. You spent $500 on a TV. Like I've been aware of that part. But now I have to look for some of these other like gamification aspects or other devices.
Right. It's one of those things where even governments are realizing the importance of this, and they have these things called nudge units where they come up with these little things to tweak and change, like you said, to increase people's organ donations or increase their voter turnout and things like that. So it's something that, okay, let's face it, humans aren't perfect and we need some help every now and then. So why not give us the best shot at making a decision that's in our best interest?
Okay. Uh, I I tend to like the nudge units. I think that that's a great idea. I think it's either nudge or thinking fast and slow came with the idea of paternalistic liberalism, I believe was their phrase. The idea is like, you get the freedom to make your own choice, but we're just gonna like, here's the nudge, or here's like the influence in the choice architecture to maybe influence the decisions to benefit society and the people and kind of help people help themselves. But if you don't want to go with that, you don't have to. You still have the freedom of choice. We're just framing the choice differently.
Right. Makes sense.
Well, this is a good talk. I like this, and I love going into way the mind and the way the brain works and how, and especially as it relates to money and helping people make better financial decisions.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I very much enjoyed our conversation today.
As did I. I look forward to our next one.
Yeah, me too. And thanks everybody for listening. Of course, if you liked what you heard, do subscribe to our podcast, and we hope to keep putting out more shows for you, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical as no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.